Welcome to Fisherman's Bend and World War II, 1936 to 1942. I'm Janet Bolitho, and I'll be co-hosting this with David Radcliffe. Before we begin, the City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of this land. We pay our respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship with the land. Before we get underway, I'd like to make another acknowledgement, and that is to Keith Raymond Meggs, who passed away on Sunday the 13th of March. He was 94. Keith joined the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation in 1943 when he was just a teenager. CAC was then still producing Boomerangs and Wirraways. He started flying at the end of 1945. In August 1948, he joined the RAAF for flying training and flew Mustangs and Meteors in the Korean War, earning a Distinguished Flying Medal and Aerial Achievement Medal. Later, he flew Vampires in Australia and Malta. He rejoined the CAC in 1957, working for several years on Sabre fighters and the series agricultural aircraft. He continued to work in the aviation industry. But over the past 50 years, Keith compiled in 4 volumes, 2 of which you can see here, a comprehensive history of 100 years of Australian aircraft building activity, published as Australian Built Aircraft in the Industry. This is the indelible legacy that Keith has left to aviation history, since it is no longer possible to gather the amount of detailed information that he compiled over such a long time. So this is the terrain that we're going to cover today. And to get your bearings, the bottom right of the screen, you see Port Melbourne Station Pier and the defining mark of the Yarra River curving over the top of Fisherman's Bend. And all this area between the river and Williamstown Road was known as Fisherman's Bend. I'm not going to go to talk a little about Australian Prime Minister John Curtin, who was Prime Minister in some of the most difficult days of the Second World War. And since this is a talk that is principally about the place, about Fisherman's Bend, to know that John Curtin began his working life in what is now South Bank at the Titan wire manufacturers. And also during the First World War, John Curtin was a determined fighter against conscription, and he would have been seen on the Yarra River bank and perhaps even down in Port, handing out pamphlets and so on against the war. So it was an irony that this man, whose life was deeply committed to peace, found himself as the helm of the nation in this very difficult time. And just going to the more immediate context, note that particular date. We'll go back one, the 7th of October 1941, when Curtin became Prime Minister. He'd been elected just not long before, in September 1941, by the narrowest of margins, 600 votes. And the Australian Parliament at that time was evenly balanced between Menzies' United Australia Party and the Australian Labor Party. And the whole government rested on the votes of 2 independent members. And when those independents declined to support Menzies any further, Curtin became the Prime Minister. And everyone who speaks of Curtin speaks of his incredible sense of responsibility. He couldn't bear others' pain, and the weight of the responsibility sat heavily upon him, but he was equal to the task. And so this date, the 7th of October 1941, is quite relevant as we look at the events that were to unfold so shortly after. So between October 1941 and the 26th of February 1942, there was a cascade of disastrous events unfolding in the war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought America into the war. But perhaps, more, well, that was a critical event, of course, but to Australia, the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the repulse off Singapore was a portent of what it was to come. Menzies and many others shared an unshakable belief in the superiority of Britain's naval power. It was an unquestioning belief in their naval power, and the sinking of these great ships signalled that that assumption was not to be relied upon anymore. They didn't see what Curtin and others saw so clearly, that the future of the Second World War would depend more on the air than on the sea. And so on the 27th of December 1941, Curtin published his thoughts in an article in the Herald, which were called The Task Ahead. And because this is such a very significant speech, I'm just going to quote a little bit from it, because he saw what was ahead in the coming months. He said, "Our task for 1942 is stern. The position Australia faces internally far exceeds in potential and sweeping dangers anything that confronted us in 1914 to 18. And he turned to two aspects, the external and the internal. Externally, he said, we refuse to accept the dictum that the Pacific struggle must be treated as a subordinate segment of the general conflict, because Britain continued to put the war in Europe first. And then he made this very famous utterance, without any inhibitions of any kind, to make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. And so this was a major departure in Australians' war and foreign policy approach, and it caused ructions with Britain. But then he turned to the internal aspect, which David will address later. The second is the reshaping, in fact the revolutionising, of the Australian way of life until a war footing is attained quickly, efficiently and without question. And he then turned to the Australian people, saying Australians must be perpetually on guard against the possibility at any hour, without warning, of raid or invasion. All Australia is at stake in this war. All Australians must stand together to hold that stake. So now we're going to look at how Australia prepared itself to participate as an active player in the defence of Australia. Next one. So this volume is a photographic album maintained, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, by Lawrence Hartnett. I'd like to introduce you to Hartnett. Hartnett was an Englishman who'd worked at Vickers in England, and he was brought out to Australia by General Motors Holden to be the new managing director for this newly merged entity, General Motors and Holden, and there were significant tensions in this merger. Now, Hartnett was an extremely energetic person, and he came to oversee the assembly of motor vehicles in the plant that was then in City Road in South Melbourne. But the plant was very crowded and not really suited to the ambitions that Hartnett had and General Motors had for the expansion of this significant enterprise. So in 1935, he set about looking for new premises for their plant. And Hartnett was a great storyteller, especially when his role in the story was involved. And he recounted in later years how he chartered an aircraft and surveyed the scene from above to see where this factory might be located, and saw the wide expanse of the then unoccupied Fisherman's Bend and thought that would be just the spot for the factory. Now, the problem was that that land at that time was Crown land, and General Motors Holden wanted to acquire it. So that involved some negotiation with the government, you know, who had to make a change of policy in order to change the land for sale. And so an actual Act of Parliament was required, the South Melbourne and Port Melbourne Land Act 1935, to make this land available for the construction of the factory. Now, from the government's point of view, this was a very attractive proposition. Victoria was just coming out of the Depression, and this plant offered the prospect of huge amounts of employment in the construction of the factory itself and later in its workings. So the government agreed to the proposition and sold the land to GMH for £800 an acre, 50 acres. And not only that, that they requested that, you know, down payment be in cash. And so it was very unusual in the Victoria of that particular time for such a capital injection to be made into the Victorian economy. Next slide. So here they are at work, beginning to lay the foundations of the factory at Fisherman's Bend. And this photograph represents so much. First of all, it shows the sandy nature of Fisherman's Bend, which was very much its character. And many had counselled Hartnett against establishing a factory here on account of the ground conditions, but he was determined. But also it shows the change of an era in many ways. The horse and the man and the other men who dug the foundations of this great factory. But to the right, you'll see the bunker of a hole on the former Victorian golf course. So the sort of leisured activity that once took place in this part of Fisherman's Bend was about to give way to very intense industry. And here you'll see them staking their claim, next slide, to the site. And I quite love this slide. It sums it all up. You know, they're really putting their stake into this part of the world. Next slide. And so here, you know, so often the views of Fisherman's Bend are aerial, and this one taken western part of Fisherman's Bend shows the scale, extent and scope of the factory, and also its relationship with the river wharves, to which they were given access in that Act of Parliament to which I referred. But you can also see that the factory is relatively isolated, that there's not much around it. And it was also the government's hope that in due course others would take up the opportunity of co-locating near the GMH factory. And Hartnett was very strategic in his choice of the location because of its proximity to those river wharves where all the raw materials and material for assembly came in. And in the next slide, you see the pride of the GMH Administration Building, still very recognisable today, and just what a triumph it represented to Hartnett in particular to have brought all this about in such a short space of time. As he recalled later, there we were out in the blue with no roads, water, gas or electricity, and in 6 months and 2 weeks we were building cars. The next slide. And here we see Hartnett, you know, at this peak of his sense of achievement with Prime Minister Joe Lyons in the centre, who, of course, unknown to anybody present, was to die not long after. And when that first car drove off the assembly line, and remember, GMH was assembling cars at this time, not manufacturing them, the person who was at the wheel of the car was Director John Storey, whom you'll hear more about later. Now, another very influential figure at this time was Essington Lewis, the general manager of BHP at this time. Now, unlike Hartnett, Essington Lewis avoided the spotlight. He was always far too busy working. He was just a complete workaholic. But in the late 1930s, Lewis, as a steelmaker, visited Germany and Japan, and it was quite apparent to him how they were both scaling up for military production. And he was seriously alarmed about Australia's lack of preparedness as well as their complacency. So he came back to Australia determined to change the situation, and he brought together a consortium which included BHP and also Broken Hill Australian Smelters, ICI, the Orient Steamship Company and GMH into a consortium which they called the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, shorthand CAC. Now, although the name Commonwealth is prominent in the title, it must be made very clear that this was entirely a private undertaking, supported by the government indeed, but it was not a government enterprise. Now, they decided that it was essential that Australia should start to develop some air capacity. Australia's a large country with a huge coastline, and the war was likely to be fought in the air. So they found the very best person in Australia to assist them with this task, and that person was Sir Lawrence Wackett, who was then at Mascot in Sydney. And they sent Wackett and a team over on a fact-finding mission around the world. They visited various countries, including the US and the UK. And you know, they had particular requirements in mind. They were building an aircraft industry from scratch, so they had to begin with something relatively simple, but something that could be scaled up, that could use the materials that were on hand, but that also had an eye towards the future. So Wackett and his team came back and recommended a plane called the NAA 33, which was a training aircraft, and they began production of this aircraft, which was to become known as the Wirraway. Okay, we'll have the next one. So here we see GMH and the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation more or less side by side in that great expanse of Fishermans Bend. And the two factories were to work very closely together during the war. Okay, so at 1100 hours on the 27th of March 1939, the very first flight of a Wirraway took place. Everyone down tools to witness it. And here you see Essington Lewis to the left, next to Lawrence Wackett in the dark suit, and with Harold Darling, also from BHP, beside this mega achievement, which was the Wirraway. And over the course of the next years, production scaled up with the Wirraway, which then had to also to be adapted for military purposes. And here just a few photographs indicating the production of the Wirraway. So I like this slide for demonstrating, if we could go back one, that we went on the 27th of March 1939 from the one to the many, from an individual aircraft to an aircraft industry. And not only that, by the end of the war, 755 Wirraways been built. Now it's fair to say, and important to include, though it's tragic to do so, that the Wirraway in action was no match for the Japanese Zero. The Zero could fly much faster, was a more powerful aircraft, and then some unbelievably tragic circumstances in New Guinea. The airmen in the Wirraway were gunned down by the Zeros, you know, in a very tragic circumstances, 8 Wirraways against 100 Zeros. But this is not to diminish the contribution of the Wirraway in the war, because it set the foundation for the whole aircraft industry. Without the Wirraway, other things would not have been possible, and it continued to serve a vital role in training and support functions. Slide. So this is just included to show the Wirraway in relation to the buildings, which, you know, very significant structures and built in such a short space of time, just to give you a sense of the stature of the operation underway. But when Hartnett started off proudly assembling his cars at GMH, although he, like Lewis, anticipated the war and did everything he could to be prepared for it, the whole of GMH was turned over. Cars were put to the side in favour of wartime production. So GMH made components of the Boomerang and wings, as you can see in this photograph, but they also went on to make all manner of things in support of the war: engines, ambulances, support vehicles. but perhaps less familiar and more surprising is the number of boats that they produced, which were so necessary in the Pacific campaign, dinghies, pontoons, things of that nature. But another thing about GMH, because both Hartnett and Lewis went on to play central roles in the commissioning of military hardware of all types in the Commonwealth War Council. But the thing that was hampered them in many instances was the lack of materials. And in many cases, they were making things that they had never made before. This was both on account of shortages once they were unable to get supplies from Britain, but there was also the circumstance where they just never made such a thing before. So in the next slide, you will see how they discovered at GMH that they could make a very good gun, but unless you could see where that gun was aiming, the gun wouldn't be much good. And Australia had absolutely no history of making high quality optical glass. And so Hartnett convened this group of people who scoured the land for the most skillful people to assist, and under the leadership of Levy there in the centre, these scientists got together to source and refine everything that was required for the manufacture of optical glass. And once again, Britain was pretty discouraging about this venture, saying, you know, don't even bother, the war will be over before you've got organised. But within 1 year of commencing this project, this optical glass was in use in the Pacific Theatre. So I think that now we turn to David.
Thank you, Janet. What I'm going to do now is to build on that background with GMH and with the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation and talk about some of the other aspects of the aircraft industry that developed at Fishermans Bend during the war. So in this image, another aerial shot with the Yarra in the foreground, it's probably about 1943. You can see the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation in the middle. It's now much larger than you saw in the earlier shot. To the right of it is something called the Beaufort Division of the Department of Aircraft Production, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. And following that, I'll talk about the operation on the left of the image, which is called the CSIR Division of Aeronautics. So let's go to the Beaufort. So the Beaufort bomber, originally a torpedo bomber, was designed by the Bristol Aircraft Company in the UK. It was a much more complex aircraft than the Wirraway. You can see that it's got twin engines. It had a crew of 4. And the idea was that we were going to import some of these and then maybe assemble some. However, there was a lot of issues in the process of getting it here because a lot of the drawings, a lot of the information were incorrect. We made about 2,000 modifications to the basic design, not least changing the engines from the original one. In the end, 700 were built, but it was a long, complex story. It became a major, a fairly important aircraft in terms of maritime patrol and strike in the Pacific War. So let me take you back to a little bit of that history of how it came to be made. Now, this image, series of pictures, 1939, there again is the sand dunes just to the other side of Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. A year later, there's the first building of what became the Beaufort Division. And then a year later, you can see inside of it, they're starting to put some aircraft together. And then even within the same 1941, there you are again, suddenly mass. So you get a sense of the speed that you go from a piece of dirt to a mass production, just as you saw with the Wirraway. As I said a moment ago, the original plan was to import maybe most of the elaborately transformed parts of it and just assemble it here. and some of these aircraft would be for the RAF and the RAAF. But then in 1940, the UK stopped exporting any war materials anywhere. And so suddenly we had to build these aircraft ourselves, basically from scratch. And that took quite an effort. And it's a long, drawn-out process, and I'll just tell you part of it now. But first, I need to set the scene about how the aircraft industry was organised during the war. So in this chart here, you can see if you start at the top, this is December 1941. You've got the War Cabinet that makes the main decisions. The Minister for Aircraft Production was Donald Cameron, a senator from Victoria. He was actually born in 1879. He only entered Parliament at the age of 60 in the 1938 election. So, in the government, he was keen that we had an aircraft industry that was about defence and not about big profits and big salaries. So under the minister, there was a Director General of Aircraft Production, who is Essington Lewis, who you heard about a moment ago. So Essington Lewis actually was in charge of all the munitions. It no longer involved with the CAC directly. And he oversaw the Department of Aircraft Production, amongst other things. And below that, you can see the four elements in the aircraft production. First of all, you've got the Commonwealth Aircraft Company Corporation, I should say, which is proprietary limited. As Janet emphasised, this was a private organisation, but its operations had to tie in with the national government-run aircraft production system. Lawrence Wackett was the managing director. Then you've got the Beaufort Division next door, which was headed by John Storey. John Storey had actually visited America in the 30s when he was working for GMH, and he actually laid out and designed and got working the GMH plant. So he ended up, it's a long, complicated story which I want to go into, but he ended up heading the Beaufort Division. And underneath each of these, you can see the aircraft that they designed and built. De Havilland Aircraft in Sydney, which was already in existence, but it came under this broad umbrella. They were building tiger moths and later mosquitoes. And there was also a maintenance division. So if we look at the Beaufort Division, the leader was John Storey, as I said, and he was very much an inspirational leader. I'll read you this quote. This is from 1943 at a meeting of the Institute of Industrial Management, of which he was the president. It was one thing to choose the ideal aircraft, but quite another to build it in a country lacking experience in aircraft construction, and with a limited pool of technicians and skilled labour and no facilities for producing machine tools, small tools, jigs and gauges, and many thousands of aircraft parts essential to a project of such magnitude. And he goes on subsequently. Had we had any conception of these difficulties, I feel we would have recommended the abandonment of the Beaufort project. He wouldn't have, because he wasn't that sort of person. But briefly, he was born in Sydney. He finished a science degree at University of Sydney in 1917. He then enlisted, and he came from a strong working family, and his father and his uncle suggested he join as a private rather than an officer, which he could have done given his degree, because they figured if you're going to lead people later, you need to understand what it is to be led. He then had a career where he was involved in the motor trade. He was the president of the motor trade in New South Wales from here, then joined GMH, and as I said, was involved with setting up the GMH plants both in Pagewood and Fishermans Bend, and then he had the job with the Beaufort Division. He worked with two prime ministers, with Menzies and with Curtin. He was really idolised almost by the workforce. He thought management was a vocation, and he thought any bad unhappiness on the shop floor was really to do with management. And he actually spent a bit of his later career establishing training for what we'd call today middle managers. So that's like supervisors on the shop floor. So let's look at this organisation, the Beaufort Division, which he headed up. This was a major national undertaking. So let me explain the diagram. If you start at the bottom, there's these aircraft each had about 39,000 components, and they were made in multiple facilities across many states. 600 or so contractors and suppliers. If you come up to the middle part, there were a number of station places where parts were made into sub-assemblies. So GMH at Woodville in South Australia, the Department of Aircraft Production Annex in Victoria, and the CAC Aircraft Factory in Lidcombe, which is actually where they built the engines. And all of those parts coming up through from the contractors and these assembly places into three major sub-assembly groups, one at Islington Railway Workshops in South Australia, one at the Newport Railway Workshops in Victoria, and one at the Railway Workshops in New South Wales. And then from there, those major subcomponents came together either at Fishermans Bend and also at Mascot in Sydney, where the aircraft was assembled. This is a major logistics undertaking. We've all learnt in recent times about supply chains. Well, this is a classic example of a major supply chain organisation. I'll just give you a snapshot, a visualisation of some of the components being made in the people. So you can see on the top left, a process called wheeling. There's a machine shop in the middle, and a couple of women doing guillotining of metal. Down the lower left, you've got a stamping machine, tool design, and also some riveting. Here's the front assembly going on in the railway workshops in New South Wales. You get a sense of the scale. There's all the front fuselages all lined out there. You can see the intensity of the work in the top left. Here's the assembly of the undercarriages, again, in the railway workshops in New South Wales. With the two men working there, you get a sense of the size and the scale of the operation. This is a picture of the twin Wasp engines which were used in the Beaufort and several other aircraft in Australia being done at the Lidcombe factory. Across the Newport Railway Workshops in Victoria, here's the skinning or the putting on of the outer metal of the rear fuselage. Again, the sense of the scale, just row after row. It's a great little photograph of people working, men and women, on the tailplane. I just love the attire on the left. It's just wonderful, very hipster. Here's the outer wings being made on Jigs. This is in South Australia, the Essington workshop. And then when all these pieces are made all around Australia, they had to be brought to Melbourne or to Sydney to be assembled. So here's a sequence of images. Upper left, you can see in Islington workshops, there's the finished outer wings being put into a container. The lower, you can see the container being taken out by a small locomotive. And then on the upper right, you can see there's components arriving at Fisherman's Bend. And here's another image which just shows so much of the time in terms of the level of equipment that are being used and the scale of things. And perhaps one of the best images, here's a real rear fuselage container going along Yarra Bank Rd, which is now South Bank Promenade. And if you were to stand there today, the two buildings you can see will be dwarfed by everything else that's there. All of these components and sub-assemblies appear at Fisherman's Bend, and here you can see outer wings in the foreground, then some fuel tanks, and then some centre planes, and then some rear fuselages. And they all get put together. So if you start on the top left, there's the centre plane or the inner part of the wing. Top right, there's that centre plane being joined to the rear fuselage. Lower right, you can see the stern frame and the tail assembly being put onto the fuselage, and on the lower left you can see the front fuselage being joined. So you get a sense of it all coming together. And then there's the final fitting out where you've got to put on the engines and the undercarriage and the turret and so on and so forth. And there's the first Australian-made Beaufort bomber in August 1941. So you get a real sense, I hope, of how this all the components that have to be created, how they all have to be then assembled and put together. So in terms of production, you can see here, this is a chart that shows along the horizontal axis the year, month by month, and vertically you can see the number produced, and you see the numbers rising slowly at first, a bit of a hiccup, and then they get up towards the target, which was 30 per month, and then they more or less hold that, they exceed it, and then as the war goes on and the need drops, so does the production. In terms of the workforce, I thought it's instructive to get a sense of the sheer numbers here. So we're talking about tens of thousands of people. And if you look at the various facilities, and I've marked several of those in yellow to highlight them, and look at the male and female participation. So in the Fishermans Bend assembly, it's largely male. But then at the Newport railway workshops where they were doing those rear fuselages, it's a little more towards balanced. Perhaps stereotypically, the training skills is largely women, and also stereotypically, the heavy forge annex is all men. The picture on the left, which is just fascinating, is called drafting. It's where you do basically full-scale drawings of parts to do with the wing. This is also something that the public were aware of. So what this image here is in 1944 from memory. It's Myers in Burke Street, and there's a crane. If you just can make out in the middle a man standing with a crane pointing out and where the arrow is pointing, that's one of the engines being taken through the wall for a display, which included engines, the turret on the left and so forth. It was all part of raising funds during the wartime. But now I want to move you to another part of the production of aircraft at Fishermans Bend, a very important part. This is the CSIR division of Aeronautics. So it's the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, a forerunner of the CSIRO. And it was set up for two purposes. One, to assist the RAAF and industry to solve problems during manufacture and operation of all the aircraft from all the manufacturers, but also to undertake longer term research and deal with fundamental problems so that you could be thinking about future aircraft with a local industry. And on the left, and the four different areas they looked at were aerodynamics, structures and materials, engines and fuels, and instruments. And then the picture on the left is Lawrence Coombs, who was the inaugural director. So he was hired in 1938 to help set this up. His background was that he was a RAF pilot in World War I. He was got a distinguished flying cross. He shot down 15 aircraft. He then had a career as an aeronautical engineer at Farnborough and other places. And so when he came here, he had a lot of experience. The division started to build facilities at Fishermans Bend in 1939, as you can see on the right-hand side. And the first building, the main building that's still there, if you go up Lorimer Road today and you see the brick building, that's now part of the Defence Science and Technology Group. That was completed in May 1940, and they moved in, and the rest of the facilities were finished within the next year. And one of those facilities, finished in 1941, is the 7x9 wind tunnel, which is still there. And so it was the first of its type of any of this sales in Australia. There was some assistance from the University of Melbourne where they built a scale model. The actual physical large structure that you can see there was built by a local engineering firm at Springvale. The large electric motor and controls came from the UK. And just to try and explain roughly how it works, if you look at it, you can see, and I'll try and point to it, you can perhaps see that this is a loop, a big circular loop, and it's large in some parts and smaller in others. And what happens is there's a electric motor drives a giant fan, so air circulates in a loop around there, and it's brought to the test section where you control the flow so that it's not too turbulent, and there you put a test model, and on the right hand side here you can see the Boomerang fighter being tested in probably 1942, and the air flows over it. You can start to see whether it needs to be modified or improved in some way or other. Just for a bit of fun, here's the Boffins at play. So this is 1943 when they had a picnic day with three-legger races and other such things. So while they worked hard, they also had some fun. So that brings the talk to a close. Just a reminder there on the image, you can see again by 1945, when this aerial photograph was taken, you can see the extent to which GMH has grown. You can see the Aeronautical Research Labs, CAC and DAP, and the runways. You get a whole sense of how from almost nothing in 1935, virtually the whole of that area north of Williamstown Road has been filled in by these automotive and aeronautical industries. In pulling this together, Janet and I have drawn on a large number of sources, of image sources, and we just wanted to mention several of those. And particularly, you saw the cover of the book earlier on to do with the GMH collection. There's also Essington Lewis's collection and lots of other sources. So with that, we'd just like to thank you and hope that you've enjoyed this walk or virtual walk around the industry that was created on Fishermans Bend to support our efforts during the Second World War. I thank you.